starting.
And I just told Vivienne I'll start in Swedish and then we'll switch to English when Vivienne starts talking. Så där. Klockan är 10 och välkommen till MSCs webbinarium om bottentrålning. Jättekul att ni är här. And I also want to say hi and welcome to the English speakers in the audience. I saw that there were a few in the audience that were non-Swedish speakers. Very welcome. We will start the webinar in Swedish, but be patient. In 10 to 15 minutes, we will switch over to English. Så varmt välkomna. Jag heter Christopher Frånberg och är marknadsutvecklare på MSC Sverige. Idag har vi äran att ha med oss Vivienne Kudelka som är fiskeriexpert i MSC Tyskland. Och även Kate Wright som är livscykelanalyst och bentisk ekologiexpert och är verksam i MSC Storbritannien. Lite guidelines för dagen är att vi kommer hålla på till ungefär 11:15. Ni får gärna ställa frågor i Q&A-funktionen. Frågorna kommer inte dyka upp för någon annan utan kommer bara dyka upp för oss här på MSC. Och i slutet av webbinariet kommer vi ha ungefär 15 minuter att svara på frågorna. De frågorna vi inte hinner svara på kommer vi att lägga upp på msc.org med svar från Vivienne och Kate. Webinariet kommer att spelas in och sen laddas upp på MSC så att ni kan ta del av den där och dela med till kollegor som inte har kunnat varit på webbinariet. Dagens agenda, vi är väldigt många en skara olika människor med olika bakgrund i publiken, så vi kommer först och främst ha en kort introduktion om MSC och även en kort översikt av olika fiskemetoder. Sen kommer Vivienne djupdyka i bottentrålning. Och sen kommer Kate prata om koldioxidutsläpp relaterat till fiske. Och sen kommer vi gå på en Q&A. Så MSC, det är en icke-vinstdrivande organisation. Det är en tredjepartscertifiering, vilket innebär att det inte är MSC som bedömer själva fiskarna, utan MSC sätter upp ett regelverk eller en standard som sen oberoende experter bedömer fiskarna utifrån. Vi är forskningsbaserat, vilket betyder att vi är baserad på Havsforskningsrådets rekommendationer. Och vi tar ingen finansiering från yrkesfisken. Däremot är MSC ett marknadsdrivet program, vilket innebär att det finansieras av den här blå logotypen. Så att lite förenklat kan man säga att när en kommersiell partner använder den blå logotypen så betalar man 0,5% av försäljningen eller inköpsvärdet till MSC. Och de här pengarna de går till att informera vikten om hållbart fiske, förbättra MSC-standarder och hjälper in nya fisken in i programmet. Och MSC är baserat på 3 standarder. Det man kan säga att det är hjärtat i MSC. Och där har vi spårbarhetsstandarden som säkerställer leverantörskedjan och säkerställer till konsumenten att den produkten som är MSC-certifierad faktiskt kommer från ett MSC-certifierat fiske. Vi har även en algstandard som vi delar med ASC som är en partner till MSC som fokuserar på hållbar odling. Och det mest relevanta idag är fiskeristandarden, eller för dagens webbinariet fiskeristandarden, som är då standarden för ett hållbart fiske. Och fiskeristandarden den är baserad på 3 huvudprinciper. Och det är att det ska vara hälsosamma bestånd, det ska vara minimal ekosystempåverkan och en effektiv förvaltning. Och i de här 3 huvudprinciperna så vilar det 28 stycken prestationsindikatorer som då fisket bedöms utifrån. Och jag tycker att det är väldigt viktigt idag också att understryka att alla lagliga fiskeredskap kan bedömas enligt MSCs program, så att MSC exkluderar inte ett fiske på grund av att en speciell fiskemetod används. Så att är fiskemetoden laglig så kan fisket bedömas enligt MSC-standard. Jag tänkte vi snabbt kan gå igenom lite vanliga fiskemetoder som används och som finns inom MSCs program innan vi djupdyker in på bottentrålning. Där har vi långrev som bedrivs med antingen pelagiska eller demersala långlinor, som är en lina man lägger längs vattnet med krokar som hänger neråt. Och de kan vara upp mot 100 kilometer långa och man kan ha flera tusen krokar på de här linorna. Med de pelagiska långlinorna så fiskar man eller riktar sig mot olika sorters tonfisk, svärdfisk, och med demersala långlinor så fokuserar man på hälleflundra, torsk, kummel, patagonisk, tandfisk till exempel. Och det kan finnas utmaningar med långrev att man kan få stora delar bifångst, vilket man måste hantera om man ska kunna pröva mot MSCs standard. Nät och garn, annan vanlig fiskemetod, läggs på 15 till 140 meters djup, kan vara upp mot 200 meters längd. Det är ett så kallat passivt redskap. Det finns drivgarn och stationära nät. Drivgarnen hänger fritt i vattenmassan och drivs med strömmar. Man inriktar sig på pelagiska arter som sill och makrill. Och samma sak här, att det finns en utmaning med bifångst. Men även med spökfiske om det skulle vara så att ett av redskapen, om man tappar bort ett av redskapen så fortsätter det att fiska utan att man kan ta användning av fisken. Ringnot som består av en flytande del och en sjunkande del, och där man kan sätta ihop den sjunkande delen så att det blir som en stor håv. Där fiskar man ofta pelagiska stimarter, sardiner, makrill och framförallt tonfisk. Och även här finns en utmaning med bifångst. Vi har pelagiska trålare, släpas av 1 eller 2 båtar. Och den här trålen hålls då upp av tråldörrar. Där är ingen kontakt med botten så att det blir ingen direkt effekt på bottenhabitat. Man fångar stora delar pelagiska arter som sill, makrill och blåvitling. Och återigen, bifångst kan vara en utmaning, men med teknologisk utveckling har man lyckats att sänka andelen bifångst när man kan specificera på den målarten som man vill fiska med ekolod och annat. Det är även diskuterats på senare tid om att man får in så mycket fisk i varje tråldrag och att det kan påverka genetiska variationen hos bestånden. Det är forskning som sker just nu och det finns inget klart svar exakt hur det påverkar bestånden. Men det får vi veta framöver. Och anledningen till att vi är här idag, som vi vet mer om, är att vi ska prata om bottentrålning. Det är alltså trål som släpas längs botten och cirka 1/4 av all vildfångad sjömat idag är fångad med bottentrål. Man fångar arter som torsk, kolja, kummel och olika sorters plattfisk. Men även skaldjur såsom räkor och havskräftor. Väldigt het debatt om bottentrålning kan vara hållbart. Det finns utmaningar med bifångst, habitatförstöring om man trålar på känsliga habitat. Och även koldioxidanvändning är ett ämne som har lyfts upp på senare tid. Så därför skulle jag vilja presentera vår första talare. So let me introduce Vivienne Kudelka, who is a fishery expert by training. At MSC, she is a bottom trawling expert and is located in Germany. We are very happy to have you here to share your expertise with this Swedish audience.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the good overview. I'm happy to talk to you about bottom trawling today, although it's a very difficult topic. I'm based in Berlin and I'm with the MSC for 14 years now. And let's dive right in. So I decided to give this talk and to concentrate my presentation on bottom trawling because there is a very one-sided public discourse or public debate on bottom trawling. And I thought it would be interesting and also important to look at the topic from a more diverse point of view. So the topic bottom trawling is usually portrayed very ideologic, very generalized, very black and white. It's often compared to plowing fields on land, or as you can see here, it's a bit of an older Greenpeace campaign, Save the Arctic, where the bottom trawling is compared to a construction site. And yeah, it's all very radical and dramatic. And I would like to have a bit more of a more differentiated and constructive discussion on bottom trawling. Let's look at how bottom trawling began. So it's not just a modern phenomenon. Bottom trawling has been around for a long time. So as you can see here, there's bottom trawling connected to sailboats, twin fishing, so with two boats or one boat. And you can also see that there have been early versions of even beam trawling since the 18th century. Nowadays, bottom trawling looks a lot more modern and usually bigger, so big scale, high industrialized bottom trawlers are out there fishing at least 25% of our catch. So that's quite a big share. They're big and industrialized fisheries. They're also often portrayed as very bad, as bad as big, and big as bad. And I have to say that yes, they're big and industrialized fisheries, but they also have big potential to implement sustainable practices. And the idea of a sustainable fishery being small scale is, I think, romanticizing the reality, unfortunately. But there's also small scale fishermen that use bottom trawls, as you can see here on the next slide. That's a picture of when our shrimp fishery was certified in the Wadden Sea. There's about 200 small vessels that are family owned, and yeah, they can be called small scale, I would say. On the next slide, I have given you an overview that I have taken from a paper that is called New Perspectives on an Old Fishing Practice, where you have pro arguments on one side and contra arguments on the other side. So often bottom trawling is seen as a very unselective gear, or portrayed as a very unselective gear that catches about everything and is very destructive to the bottom habitats. It's often seen as taking away the catch from small-scale fishermen and displacing the livelihoods of small-scale fishermen. And it's also seen as just being destructive. So there's only one aspect to it, and it can only be destructive. While on the other hand, I have to say that bottom trawling is a fishery practice that can be managed like other fishing practices as well. And so management is key here. And common pro-trawling counterpoints then are that bottom trawling is a very effective fishing method, and it's one of the only ways to manage to supply the market with the amount of fishing products that is needed to a certain price. That is also, yeah, so that everybody can afford eating healthy fish products. And bottom trawling, of course, it's so every human activity is has having an impact on our environment. And bottom trawling can also be very destructive, but also bottom trawling is usually, for instance, as one of the pro arguments is that bottom trawling is often often done in an area where there has been bottom trawling for a long time, and fishermen keep to their trawls tracks because it's usually the same area where the fish can be fished, so it's the same areas, and it's often only a small portion of a whole ecosystem. So there's a lot more to the ecosystem than just the area that is trawled. So on our next slide, you can see a quite clear claim coming from the MSC, which is not usual. I would say we are usually somewhere in the middle of everything. But when it comes to banning bottom trawling in MPAs, which is often heard of lately, I have to say that we are not supporting, so as MSC, we are not supporting this demand to ban all bottom trawling in MPAs. So while I think it is very important to extend the amount of marine protected areas in the oceans, I don't think we can be as indiscriminate as banning all bottom trawling from all MPAs. So it wouldn't help the environment and it wouldn't help us either. And why I think that, I'll get into when I go further into the presentation. First of all, I would like to shed a little bit of light on the aspects of the MSC standard for sustainable fisheries, because while you hear a very one-sided debate on bottom trawling being very destructive, you can also see that about 25% of the catch that is certified by the most credible MSC standard, the most credible standard for sustainable fisheries, there must be another side to this, right? So there's definitely a contradiction here. So how is it possible that we have so many sustainably certified fisheries in our program? Maybe the situation and the reality isn't as one-sided as it seems. I gave you a little bit of an overview. So Chris already mentioned we have 28, I think it's 25 in the new standard indicators for how a fishery is assessed, and under Principle 2, so the impact on the ocean, on the habitats, there's these 5 indicators that are looking at the impact of the fishery on the habitat aspects and on the bicaught species. And the habitat is looked at as the habitat and the ecosystem as a whole. Don't worry too much about primary and secondary. It's the species that are being bicaught. So the fishery standard is outcome based. So it's not as if you're familiar with, for instance, organic certification schemes, you would find limits in the fishing standard. It's not very suitable to work with limits. Like we cannot work with limits like a sustainable fishery has a maximum of 10% bycatch or 5% bycatch, because even 5% of bycatch would be a lot in a pelagic fishery and would be very, very little in for instance, the bottom trawl fishery. So the standard is framed outcome based. So and in detail, that would sound like that, for instance, bicaught species in certified fisheries must be above the PRI. So that's the point of recruitment impairment, and with a high degree of certainty. So what fisheries here have to demonstrate is that the fisheries that they are encountering in the catch, that they're on a healthy level, or if they're not on a healthy level, which is also possible, the fisheries impact has to be in a way that it's not hindering their recovery, for instance, for ETP species or other threatened species. A certified fishery must be highly unlikely, and also highly unlikely is then explained in the standard, to cause serious or irreversible harm to the habitats. So all bottom trawl fisheries that are certified had to prove that the impact that they're certainly having is not causing the environment long term. So there would always be a visible impact, but it has to be short term, and the habitat has to be able to recover. And for that, you have to look at the aspects of the habitat. So what habitat is the fishery encountering? What's the recovery rates? How long do species need to reproduce? And this is all covered under information performance indicators. So a fishery that wants to become certified has to have a lot of information about their habitats. And then, of course, last but not least, the fishery has to have management measures in place that ensure that the fishery does not pose a risk of serious or irreversible harm to the ecosystem and the structure and function. So that's, I would say, one of the most important performance indicators that are assessed under our standard. So we do not only have the principle 3, which only covers management aspects of the fishery, but in each performance indicator is split up in these 3 categories, so outcome, information, and management. The fishery has to show what are the management measures that they're implementing, and are they working, are they likely to work, and so on. There's on the next slide, I gave you a little bit of a, I don't want to go into too deep into the scoring, but there's, of course, also in a certified fishery room to improve. So fisheries have to fulfill the standard, the minimum requirements to become certified, and then they can be seen as sustainable. But in 90% of the cases, fisheries have to fulfill conditions to improve further. And so the scoring, the scoring is done in a way that each principle is scored individually and has to reach at least a minimum of 80 points, so that, for instance, a good performance in stock status cannot outweigh a bad performance in habitat impact. That's why we have these 3 pillars, and they're scored individually. We have a lot of conditions that have been closed already. So the earliest MSC certification was in 2000. So we're having fisheries in the standard in the program that have been certified for 25 years now. One of them is the Australian rock lobster, for example, and that's also a bottom contact fishery, although it's not a bottom trawl fishery. Over the course of the certification, a lot of fisheries have improved and closed out their conditions. And here you can see the scoring from the first round of certifications to the second round of certification. Overall, you can see that there's a big improvement. So that's just numbers, right? You can see that fisheries receive a better scoring, but that also gives an indication to that fisheries are actually also improving on the water. Now, unfortunately, there is a slide missing here, but I just jump right into the shrimp gear. For instance, no, hang on, I really wanted to go into, because there's one slide missing. I'll just tell you what slide I was intending to show here now. Because only numbers, so saying over the last 3 years we have 400 closed conditions, it's not very meaningful, and oftentimes closed conditions are not very like it's not easy to visualize what's happening, because most of the things are actually happening on paper. So there's, for instance, research conducted as a result of a condition, but also in in a lot of cases, we have hands-on improvements, like in the pink shrimp fishery in Oregon. So that's the slide that is missing. There, as a result of a condition, there was some research undertaken, and the fishery actually implemented LED lights on their foot rope. I think we're looking at the brown shrimp gear right now. Here you can see a foot rope. And in the pink shrimp fishery in Oregon, they implemented lights on the foot rope, LED lights, and they were able to manage to decrease the bycatch of Eulachon. I don't know how to pronounce it in English, but it's an endangered and threatened species there in the Pacific, and they managed to decrease the bycatch by 90%. And also other species where species bycatch was reduced by a lot. In 2013, this research started. By 2018, all ships had implemented the LED lights, and then also this spread to from Oregon to California and to Washington. So it's a commonly used practice now in the fishery as a result of a condition. Now, brown shrimp. Here you can see the brown shrimp fishing gear. These pictures I wanted to show you to make sure that while we often talk about the bottom trawl fishery, there's no such thing as the bottom trawl fishery, because bottom trawling can be so different to each other. So there's these bigger trawls, there's smaller trawls. And here you can see the shrimp fishery, and you can see the foot rope having these rock hoppers. So it's rolling above the seafloor. So while the bottom trawl fishery is often portrayed as digging into the seafloor, it's actually only seldom the case that's actually digging into the seafloor. Actually, these pictures were taken in the Baltic Sea because the visibility is better in the Baltic Sea than in the North Sea. And a fisherman told me that the disturbance you can see here from the seafloor would be even less in the North Sea, because the sand is denser in the North Sea than in the Baltic Sea. And also, when it comes to management practices that are being implemented, on the next slide you can see the bycatch reduction devices that are in use in the brown shrimp fishery. So here on the left side you can see a sorting grid that is making sure that most of the bigger fish can actually exit the net. And also there's a sieve net implemented. On the right-hand side, you can see the sieve net, which is making sure that some fish that are leaving the net downward. So some fish have the tendency to move upward when they're disturbed, and some fish have the tendency to move downward. The sieve net then is making sure that other bigger individuals can leave the net to the lower side of the net. And that's actually reducing the bycatch by a lot. And then also in the brown shrimp fishery, then the catch goes on board, and then it's sieved alive with seawater, and then the sieving also what's is too big, or which is not a shrimp, is then released into the water with a high potential to survive, because everything is happening quite quickly. So while there is a high amount of bycatch compared to, for instance, pelagic fisheries, the fishery is implementing lots of management management measures to reduce the bycatch as much as possible. I think there's I really had some problems to save my presentation on our SharePoint. So I think the next slide, maybe if you jump over it, just jump over it. That's the Australian prawns. Hang on, because this is not part of the presentation I am looking at the moment. Yes, it is. So there's another. Now let's look at Australian prawns. So Australian prawns, okay, there's 63% of the Australian wild catch is certified. It's also a bottom trawl fishery, and this fishery here you can see that it certification began in 2011, and by 2023 3, we had 63% of Australian wild catch prawns certified. As they had in total, they had 47 conditions, and half of them are closed by now. And as a result of those conditions, the 5 of the 6 fisheries implemented turtle exclusion devices, and they managed to reduce the turtle interactions by 99%. Which is quite a big outcome. And the small fish bycatch reduction by 40%, sea snake bycatch reduction by 63%. On the next slide, you can see what these reduction devices look like. So it's the Tom's fish eye. It works a lot better than the square mesh panel, which is commonly used in the shrimp fishery. And on the right-hand side, you can see the turtle exclusion device, which is working very effectively. On the next slide, we're jumping back into the shrimp fishery in the Wadden Sea. As part of a condition that was closed in the brown shrimp fishery, the fishery had to, together with the University of Hamburg and the Thun Institute here in Germany, conduct a study on their impact they're having on the environment. That study was carried out until 2 years ago, and the results presented showed that untrawled areas compared to trawled areas, you could see a short-term effect of the trawling, but after 12 to 22 days, the effect actually vanished. So it disappeared completely. When you look at this, it becomes apparent that you do not only have to look at the individual fishery, so what type of gear they're using, and what type of management measurement they're having implemented, but also the type of habitat they're operating in. And the Wadden Sea is a very dynamic area of the seafloor is disturbed 2 times a day by the currents, and it's usually sandy or mobile sea floor. So the human impact is very difficult to distinguish from the natural impacts, and also the species that live in these types of habitats, they're highly resilient to human disturbance because they're highly adapted to these natural disturbances. For instance, here you can see the Lanise. It's a little worm that is making these sand structures, these tree-like sand structures, and they might be gone after a trawling event, but the worm is digging deep into the seafloor and surviving, and then it will build a new sand structure. So here, that's a very good example, I think, of how a fishery has short-term impacts, but the long-term impacts are manageable and reducible, and also reversible. And that was a very big study that was conducted here in Germany together with the research institutes, and so credible science. Also I just copy and pasted some of the text from the assessment reports from the brown shrimp fishery. And what you see in fat here is that it was found that there's little difference between the natural dynamic and the fishing gear disturbance. So that's one of the reasons why this fishery could actually pass the standard and become certified. On the next slide, you can see an example from a more industrialized fishery. It's the German High Seas Fleet, the Dogger Bank and DFFU. They're fishing in the Arctic, and they're fishing rather deep sea, so 250 meters. They fish cod, haddock, and saithe. And in that ecosystem, it is of importance to avoid these areas, because there you have long-lived species. So cold water corals, for instance, the impact a fishery is having would be long-term and often not reversible within 20 or 25 years. So here, the fishery, actually as part of a condition, implemented into the sea maps the data that is coming from a big seafloor mapping program called Mariano in Norway. So, and here the MSC could actually play a role of a connector. So oftentimes you have lots of knowledge about the seafloor and the habitats sitting somewhere in a research institute, and then you have the fishery out at sea. And connecting these two is of utmost importance. So now the fishermen are actually looking like live at the seafloor habitat types, and then they can avoid the areas actively where there's vulnerable marine ecosystems. And actually, when you look at Global Fishing Watch, where you can see the ships and you can follow them and you can see where they're fishing, you can overlay the Mariano maps with the Global Fishing Watch, and you can actually see. So it's proven that the German fleet, Dogger Bank and DFFU, that they're not inside of these vulnerable ecosystems, because now it's very easy for them because they have the data in the sea maps. And also on the next slide, there's an example from a little bit less big, but also quite big fishery in the North, operating in the North Sea, catching safe. Here, they did a lot of trials with different types of net material and also different types of trawl doors, and they found that you can actually manage the height of the net in the water by changing the length of the lines. And also here, information is key. We know that saithe swims a little bit higher in the sea column at night. So at night, when they fish at night, they can shorten the lines, and then the net is actually hardly not touching the seafloor anymore, because they're above the sea floor, and there you call that semi-pelagic, causing a lot less destruction or a lot less impact on the seafloor. My colleague Kate, which I'm really happy that she's presenting here as well, she will go a little bit deeper into the next topic that I brought to you. So because oftentimes nowadays the public discourse is not only about the direct impact on the ecosystem, the species, and the plants and animals in the ecosystem, but also about releasing seafloor carbon, because the disturbance of the seafloor. But also here, Kate will show us that the discussion is not as black and white as it seems, and often the claims that, for instance, the bottom trawl fishery is having a bigger impact on the climate than the avian industry is oversimplifying the situation by a big time. So in conclusion, I hope that it became apparent that the discussion should be a bit more diverse on bottom trawling, and that the situation is not as black and white, and black and white thinking is often not very helpful. And therefore, the having the MSC standard, or the MSC structure of looking on individual impact of fisheries rather than banning a gear type as a whole, might be a better way forward. So I would like to stop here, and maybe I don't know how do we go on now, Chris?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vivienne, for a really great presentation. It was very clear. We have received some questions, but I think we can wait with them till the end. I was just interested in that you emphasize that it's more important to assess the fisheries as a whole rather than judging them based on a single factor. Could you elaborate on why this holistic approach is important?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for that question. So usually I give this presentation in about an hour and a half, so I had to really say a lot less than I would like about this topic. And of course, it's important to highlight that a fishery operations and the impact a fishery is characterized by a lot more than just one single factor, which is the fishing gear. So it doesn't not depending on even all kinds of fisheries. You could not assess the sustainability of a fishery by a single factor, because there's so much you have to take into account, and it's a very complex situation. You have these different types of fisheries, you have different types of habitats, species, management, and so it is very important to look at all of these factors taken together. So, and that's why the MSC standard is so complex, and it also takes such a long time to assess the sustainability of the fishery. It takes about 1.5 years for a fishery to become certified because of the complexity of the situation. And I know that we as humans, we often like easy solutions for complex issues, like in all other areas of our life, but unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. And I think banning bottom trawling wouldn't have as big as an effect as we think, or people want us to think, because of the complexity of the situation.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I also really like yes and no answers, but sometimes they're not suitable for the situation, and the environment is a very complex matter. Thank you so much for the presentation, Vivienne. We'll move on with the questions at 11. Now I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Kate Wright, who is an LCA and benthic ecology expert. She's doing her PhD in Heriot-Watt University in the UK, where she studies organic carbon disturbance and the direct carbon release of fisheries and how they can be mitigated. And she is also the greenhouse gas coordinator at MSC. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much. I hope everyone can see my screen okay. There is a nice red box, so usually that's a good sign. Like Chris said, I'm here today to speak to you about the carbon impacts of fishing. I start quite broad, and then we narrow down more into the bottom trawling and how that's interacting with sediments. It does get a little technical at the end, but hopefully I don't lose you. It's a very complex topic, but it's a very important one, which is why I'm really glad we're covering it today. So, like I said, starting broad, it's probably the reason why we're all here on a webinar is climate change is such a huge issue which is threatening all our livelihoods at the moment. So obviously it's really important that everyone must play their part in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. That's right down to the consumer. What we do at home might make a big difference in the end, you never know. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is 2024, yeah, again, it was the hottest year on record. The IPCC now think that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are now living in climate vulnerable areas, so areas where, you know, rising sea level rise, all of the rest of it. And what we've seen in the last year is the ratification of climate regulations around the globe, particularly EU. Sorry, I had to remove my cat. So, for example, if you're joining us here from the EU, lots of retailers, etc. at the moment, they'll be pulling together reports for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which does have, although vaguely I understand, requirements for kind of documenting greenhouse gas emissions within your operations. And cohesively, what these regulatory goals would like to achieve is that long-term resilience and value creation. So how can a company mitigate the very real risks of climate change whilst identifying meaningful opportunities, potentially for growth as well, in the face of climate change? So seafood is seen as a kind of like the low-hanging fruit. It's a very important protein group globally. It's highly nutritional and it's a very low carbon alternative. So if you're comparing it to other food groups, particularly beef, it's always, even the bottom trawling groups, they're always going to come under with a lot lower greenhouse gas emissions in terms of delivering that end product. But what we're seeing at the moment, particularly, obviously, the high priority for most people, if you're looking at other food groups, is reducing the emissions of beef. But my current urge to the seafood industry is to not just kind of rest on your laurels, as we'd say in the UK, in terms of other food groups are making big progress in documenting their emissions and also reducing their emissions. So what we will see is eventually that gap between beef and other food sectors and seafood will start to close. What we're also missing globally is that kind of consistent, transparent, consistent and comparable reporting. There is data out there on emissions. Seafood is getting better, but there's still quite a big data gap. And we have a project ongoing. I would be amiss to not mention it here. We have a project ongoing at the MSC, which I'm running, which is all about documenting greenhouse gas emissions from wild capture fisheries, but I'm also speaking to people throughout the supply chain. So if you are currently grappling with greenhouse gas emissions calculations, or you've done it recently within your business and you'd like to share your experiences, please do reach out to Chris, because I would love to hear from you. Plug aside, so we now know that the fishing fleets interact with carbon cycling through 3 distinct ways. One is while the fish are out on the sea, they're catching the fish, they're burning fuel, which is the predominant driver in emissions at the wild capture stage. Fuel efficiency is not a new subject area. I very rudely insulted one of my senior supervisors that this was a new topic of conversation. It's not new. If you're looking at your costs, fuel is a big thing driving your costs in fishing operations. So fuel efficiency and catch efficiency is certainly not a new topic. But what we do know is that pelagic vessels tend to be the most greenhouse gas efficient, and that's because they're targeting whole shoals. They're not interacting with the seabed, so they are burning less fuel. Fuel is proportional to engine size, a bit of a given that if you have a bigger boat, you're going to be using more fuel. And there are papers out now which are showing that greenhouse gas emissions can be influenced by the fleet structure, so particularly the age of the vessels, gear adaptation, so if you're reducing your impact on the seabed, it's likely that you have reduced your fuel consumption. And then things like fishing behavior and good fisheries management. So that particularly we're looking at the stock size. So if you have more fish in the sea, you're maybe not traveling as far to go find them, so you are burning less fuel and you are emitting less to the atmosphere. Another way that fishing fleets can interact with the carbon cycle is fish themselves are a carbon store, and they're also, depending on which fish groups you're looking at, they're also responsible for transporting that carbon to depth. So things like there's been a lot of research recently in the Antarctic krill fishery. So the Antarctic krill have also been shown to be really important to transporting that carbon to depth. Once it's kind of deeper in the oceans, it's more likely to be stored for longer timescales, which might help us in terms of climate mitigation. And then the final one, which we're going to delve a little bit more into very briefly, is this risk of disturbing carbon, which is stored in marine habitats. So organic carbon is stored in lots of marine habitats, seagrasses, salt marshes, although not necessarily a habitat for marine fish, mangroves, but the one that we're focusing on today is sediments. So the main interaction of trawl gear is with marine sediments. And in order to calculate that impact, what we do know is that the footprint, so the fishing intensity where vessels are fishing, that's generally now well understood, although I know that there are still some discussions around VMS versus AIS, but the footprint is well known. We also have a good understanding of the penetration depth, so how far that fishing gear goes into the sediment. And what we saw in the last couple of years was an estimation of, so the organic carbon that is stored in the sediment, how much of that is resuspended into the water column because of a trawl pass, and then how much of that within the water column eventually would make itself back to the atmosphere. And this first came about with a publication, it's called the Sala paper. You may be familiar with it, but that was the paper that got picked up by the media, and they directly compared the outputs of that paper to the aviation fleet. And what I wanted to do in my final 10 minutes or so is just touch on the knowledge gaps behind this current body of research, which is ongoing, and a little bit on the biogeochemical interactions, but again, hopefully keeping it a bit light and easy to understand. So the paper on the screen was kind of an update to that Sala paper. It does oversimplify a very complex system. Anything to do with the ocean is always going to be very difficult. It's a very complex system to try and model. It is a model based on a model, which has inherent difficulties with it. Within the academic community, although there's been lots of progress in the last couple of years, there's still a disagreement on the assessment of uncertainty. So how reliable are those estimates, especially with the carbon that is going back to the atmosphere? And also, I think there is still a bit of disagreement on which of the pathways are most important for measuring that impact. Having said that, it is the best model that we have available at the moment, and I know it is being applied in places like the North Sea. And it's also started the discussion. So there's a lot of funding now available to really get more concrete answers on what is the degree of impact. So how much of that organic carbon from the sediment will make its way back to the atmosphere. And so what I wanted to show you this figure, not that you necessarily need to understand it, but it's a great figure. It came out of my research institute here in Scotland, and it was out of a workshop where we got people from around, experts from the field, to sit down and kind of map out, okay, well, what are the pathways that are responsible for storing or processing organic carbon in the sediment? And then from there, we can try to understand the degree of impact from a bottom trawl pass. So this really is a great figure to basically just show how complex the system is that we are trying to model. So these are all the ways that all the ways that the organic carbon within the sediment would change. The top two here on the screen, so the removal of macrobenthos, so that's the fish, incredibly well studied, and also in terms of bottom oxygen depletion, also well studied. The bullet points in italics, sorry, so how much the transport of resuspended material, seabed community depletion, those are the types of the things that are still being studied in terms of their degree of impact, so whether it has a positive effect or negative effect. And there was just a couple that I wanted to go into a little bit more detail today, especially because they weren't necessarily captured within the Sala paper, was a little bit on benthic carbon stock. So there are big differences on the type of sediment that you have, whether you have mud or sand, can make a big difference on the amount of organic carbon that is available. But the quality of carbon in itself can change. So it's making predictions on where those changes happen. And also a little bit on the biological community. So thinking more about kind of the small invertebrates which are responsible for burrowing into the sediments. So I wanted to touch on this. I don't know whether I've translated or will describe it properly, but in terms of organic carbon, the microbial community in the sediments is incredibly important. And the quality of carbon, so the carbon that is available, so the microbial community really love labile carbon. And so the way that I'm going to try and describe this is that if you're familiar with supply chains, if you're freezing your food when it's been picked, you're freezing all those kind of nutrients, you're locking everything in as it was. If you are a fresh vegetable and you are traveling throughout the supply chain, by the time you get to the end consumer, if you're a fresh vegetable, you will have lost naturally some of those nutrients throughout the supply chain. So it will have degraded. And it's exactly the same with carbon. Organic carbon that is being flushed off the land, for example, is extremely rich. It's very high quality when it comes off the land, and that's called labile carbon. By the time that carbon travels offshore in the seabed, it's being eaten by microbes, it's being broken down, it's being transported. By the time it gets to the deeper sediments, it's called recalcitrant carbon. And that tends to be what's being buried on over longer timescales, but it's not as bioavailable to the microbial community, so they don't like to break it down. And to summarize how this is a big issue, so the quality of carbon can vary spatially across the seabed. And so understanding those differences in the quality of carbon is really important in terms of estimating the impact. Hopefully you're still following me. So the next big kind of question area, I guess, for me is the meiofauna. So we're thinking about the very small invertebrate communities. They bury into the sand, so they're really important for turning over sediment at depth. They're really important for transporting organic carbon to deeper within the sediment where it can be stored for longer timescales. All of the biological community within the sediment, they have their own limitations. So obviously they need oxygen to consume that organic carbon and process it. So the impact that these communities have on the processing and storing of carbon is really, really important. So understanding that community, how it's impacted by trawling, and trawling itself may replace some functions that those species carry out. So again, bring it back to that whole holistic picture of how the different pathways are impacted by trawling, and the degree of impact is really important to understanding the bigger picture, which is how much organic carbon comes out of the sediment, and then how much of that organic carbon within the water column will eventually make its way back to the atmosphere. So it's certainly not an easy feat to try and calculate. And if we bring it back to the SALA paper in terms of making those estimations on a global scale, so the SALA paper went for the modelling approach. It requires a lot of really good quality input data. And importantly, it should be validated by real life data points. Now, those real life data points could be measured a carbon stock change, so the flux from the air-sea interface, which is very difficult and time consuming to measure. So that's again, so the amount of carbon, coming from the surface layer of the water to the atmosphere. And it can also be validated by measuring the sediment itself. So going out and collecting sediment cores. And what a global assessment of the carbon stock change, ideally, it would look in combination of it would draw data from all three of these methods to come up with a new estimation of how much organic carbon is disturbed from bottom trawl fleets. So again, just kind of wrapping up, lots of challenges in terms of studying the changing carbon, mainly cost and time. But like I said, the SALA paper did spark off a whole there's loads of great funding available in this space now. If we were focusing on somewhere like the North Sea, obviously you have a lot of input from the terrestrial environment, which is which also needs to be understood a lot more. And again, sticking with something like the North Sea, it's a changed environment. We've been fishing on that seabed for so long. The difficulty is, one, estimating the impact from a single trawl pass, and then the next step is estimating the impact from multiple, so year-on-year trawl passes. So it's an incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult just to put a number on this. There's a lot of kind of moving parts. So I do think we are a few years away from having a more concrete answer, but like I said, there's some fantastic work ongoing at the moment and some really great well-funded studies. So just a few closing points from me and we'll take your questions. So all gears will be interacting with the seabed and they will be disturbing some organic carbon, but it's that degree of disturbance that is not yet known. And again, we don't know the impact on some of these biogeochemical processes which are responsible for storing carbon. The SALA paper and the follow-up Atwood paper, it is the best available model that we have, but there are a lot of kind of limitations and uncertainties with it, but it did spark a lot of that funding, which is incredibly important to get to the real answers. So I appreciate that might have been a bit complicated. I hope I described it well enough, or at least you to get a flavour of how difficult the equations are that sit behind some of these models. It's incredibly interesting though, so if you have any questions or would like to discuss it further at some point, please get in touch with Chris and he will forward you on, because yeah, I love this subject at the moment. So emissions from the vessel or benthic disturbance, please do reach out for, yeah, I'll pass it back over to Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please reach out if you have any questions. And thank you, Kate, for a really splendid presentation. It's a very complex matter, but I think you made it very clear. And I really liked your analogy for remineralization. I can't even say it. So thank you very much. I was very interested in slide 4, where you showed a bar chart illustrating the CO2 per food production category. You had a staple for fisheries. Do you think it would change if the fisheries were divided by fishing gear? So, for example, if there were a staple for bottom trawling and one staple for pelagic trawling, and where do you think that the bottom trawling staple would end up on that chart?
Yeah, so what I've shown on the screen here, so if you're looking at the B at the bottom half, this is your fuel use intensity. So that's the total fuel consumption for the vessel divided by the amount of catch. So it's just an expression of efficiency, really. So fuel consumption does account for about 75 to 95% of the emissions in a fishery, so at the fishing level. So it is a good indicator of how much a fleet segment might be emitting. So like I said, we see that the pelagic trawls are more efficient. That's just the way that they are fishing. And this is efficiency, don't forget. So this is how much fuel they're using per ton of catch. And we do see that the bottom trawls, and particularly pots and traps, are the less efficient ones. If you broke up this bottom trawl even further, you would see potentially the beam trawlers sitting at the higher end of that. And I don't know, maybe some wing, if you were looking at a beam trawl alternative, which has been shown to use less fuel, would have less emissions associated with it. In terms of climate mitigation, fuel efficiency is really important to look at in terms of how we can be more efficient. But if you're looking at in terms of total emissions, your pelagic boats, which are the biggest boats, they are burning the most fuel. So taking just a efficiency look in terms of climate mitigation, so looking at the pots and traps maybe more, is not going to solve the problem if we just admit the biggest emitters, which are the pelagic fleets. So again, it's not as easy as you can just focus in on one gear category and all of our problems are saved. It's coming back to that more holistic view in terms of who are the biggest emitters and who are the most efficient in catching what we catch. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, makes very much sense. Thank you very much. We could let in Vivienne also to the group to discuss some. We have received a couple of questions, and there is one question about MPAs and bottom trawling, and MSC's take on the issue. Would you want to answer that, Vivienne?
So what's the question?
Sorry, yeah, it was a statement. How is MSC looking on bottom trawling within MPAs?
Okay, so a very general question. So MPAs, marine protected areas, they can also be very diverse, and usually marine protected areas, although they are quite big within the marine protected areas, they usually have different objectives, so different aims to protect. There can be habitat aims, as in vulnerable habitats. There can be reefs to protect, but there can also be resting seabirds to protect. And in that case, for instance, a resting seabird is not as disturbed by a bottom troll fishery as a cold water coral reef. So when you look at the marine protected areas, we would also look at the individual habitat types. When you assess a fishery and under the MSC fishing standard, whether or not a fishery is conducted in a marine protected areas is only looked at from the perspective whether or not it's legal. Of course, a fishery has to be legally operating. But then looking at the impact of the fishery, we look at the vulnerability of the habitats, and that is independent of its status on paper. So we look at the reality basically, and from that point of view, it doesn't make a lot of sense to ban a certain type of gear from an entire marine protected areas. Of course, if there's within that marine protected areas areas of concern to bottom trawling, then it would make sense to ban bottom trawling in those areas, and it's often done actually. Yeah, so again, it is a differentiating view on things rather than generalizing big areas and gear types.
Yeah, understand. Once again, more a holistic view on the matter. And Kate, you raised your hand.
Yeah, and I don't know whether it's an MPA, so please forgive me, but it's a good example of kind of MPAs, but bringing in the more carbon focus. So here in the UK, we've just brought in a whole load of MPAs and HMPAs, so highly protected marine areas, but they were all set kind of before this climate kind of took off. It exploded just as we were finalising the new MPAs here in the UK. Now we have a better understanding of the carbon stores within marine sediments in the UK. We're now finding that the majority of the high quality carbon actually sits outside our MPA network. So we're now having to maybe rethink some of our MPAs to bring in that additional climate service of kind of protecting the stored carbon. And another example I wanted to give, but again, I don't know whether it was an MPA, but it was the Dogger Bank closure. So everyone will be familiar with it, I would hope. But what I heard recently on a call, which was super interesting, is that obviously that Dogger Bank closed, but we saw a lot of the redistribution of fishing effort. The Dogger Bank is actually quite low in terms of organic carbon content, but what we saw in the UK vessels then moved and started fishing somewhere that was higher quality in terms of stored carbon on the seabed. So in terms of carbon impact on the seabed, some of these closures or MPAs maybe aren't quite working effectively. And those are the types of things that we now need to think about through this new climate lens that everybody loves so much. But yeah, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a whole new dimension to the MPAs. Very interesting. We have a question for you as well, Kate. If there are any specific technological advancements that are helping to reduce carbon emission right now that you're excited about?
Well, there's a couple of things. I know I mentioned Sunwing already. It's been around for ages, but it's only just starting to be trialed in the UK fleet. So I don't know why it took us so long. But in terms of other advancements, I was talking recently with some fuel cells on boats and potentially making them more efficient, especially the otter trawls here in the UK have had some positive news stories coming out of it. So I think people are starting to start reducing their emissions, but like I said, at the moment it tends to be a lot of the funding is going towards the agricultural, so land food sectors. So again, often we're seeing that seafood is being left out of the discussion just because it's not a high priority area. It's seen as low and carbon efficient, but in terms of the energy transition, there is a lot of there's a lot of value there in that transition. So it's important that seafood don't get left behind, because ultimately there's money available for making things greener. And yeah, I don't think I answered your question, but there's a lot of exciting things going on. The EU Energy Partnership, do get involved, or if you want to know how you can get involved in certain things, come and ask Chris and he'll pass you on.
Yeah, perfect. I will. Thank you very much. We also have a question to Vivienne about bottom trawling and how large part of the ocean can actually be bottom trawling, the question is.
So that is really dependent on what type of fishery we're looking at. Usually you find a lot of the fish concentration along the shelf edges. So the continental shelf is sometimes broader, sometimes smaller, and along the edges where it's going deeper into the ocean, there is lots of productivity in the ocean, and that's why most of the trawling also happens in that areas. In the North Sea, which is completely on the shelf, we looked at, for instance, the percentage of so actually the brown shrimp fishery is operating within an MPA, for example. It's the national park in the Wadden Sea, and we looked at what is the actual area that is being touched on, and we found that because of all the areas that are too shallow or are not suitable for fishing. For instance, the brown shrimp fishery is only touching about 50, 60, I think 60% of the seafloor. So 30% of the marine protected areas are not fished anyhow by this bottom trawl. So then, worldwide on a global scale, yeah, it's a bit difficult to answer from a global perspective, but it really comes down to water depth and then also, I mean, we are not looking to touch as much seafloor as possible, but fishermen are trying to catch effectively, so they're going where they're used to go because they know the fish are there.
Yes, thank you. I think we have a follow-up question on that part. That in non-sustainable bottom trawling, what do you consider the biggest challenges are? Is it primarily related to habitat disturbance? Is it bycatch, or is it something else that is the biggest problem in general? Question is.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I have also asked myself, how come that bottom trawling even got this bad image? You know, like where does this all come from? Because there's these different types of bottom trawling and different areas, and I think it mainly comes from more like Asian areas where you have bottom trawling on a small scale, as a smaller scale ships that are a lot of ships, and they're not managed effectively because of missing information and missing knowledge about the fishery. So this is the type of image you have on mind when you think of destructive bottom trawling, as these small mesh mixed fisheries that are not fishing a certain type of species, like for instance the cod, haddock and saithe fishery. So these mixed fisheries in less developed countries, and I think the biggest problem here would be the management aspects of the fishery based on the little knowledge these fishermen have on or the fishing agencies have on the seafloor habitat types, and then the little impact the management is having on guiding fishermen, because we're not managing fish, we're managing people. So it's important to have these good management practices in place. And then if you have these, if you don't have them and don't have enough information, also the impacts then are very diverse. So it is probably also a complex situation. Like I couldn't pinpoint it on destructive bottom trawling is worse for animals or plants. You know, it's probably pretty bad for the ecosystem as a whole, and it should be avoided. Yeah, but it can't be compared to, for instance, European types of trawling.
Oh, I understand. And so it's the solution, at least, is knowledge and management. And we have one more question. Please explain PRI. I think that is for Vivienne as well.
Oh yeah, sorry. So a point of recruitment impairment is a general name for instance, BLIM, biomass limit reference points, if anybody is familiar with that. So when you assess a fish stock or any kind of species, you look at their productivity and and their amount. So how big a population is at its optimal level of productivity, and also how big a population is on the minimal level of productivity. And below that point, so below BLIM or below any type of reference points that marks this border, the reproduction of their species is so low that it won't reproduce effectively. So it cannot maintain the population size. So and then this is what has to be avoided. And above that, there's areas I would call them now in easy terms. There's the yellow area where the stock is not at an optimal level, but it's reproducing. And then there's the green area. And if a stock is in this yellow area, so for instance in Europe below B trigger, then the fishery has to make sure that there's management in place to not hinder the recovery, or to make sure that actually the fishing pressure is reduced, and there's management measures in place that then kick in to regulate the fishery to make sure it's coming back into the green. But we do want these fisheries that are in the yellow to stay also in the program as long as possible, because the MSC system is an extra incentive on these fisheries to then improve their practices and decrease fishing pressure to keep the MSC label. That was a long explanation.
It was a long, but clear answer.
For PRI.
Yeah, okay, so thank you. We reached time. Thank you, Vivienne. Thank you, Kate, for very good presentations. We're very happy that you shed some light on trawling and CO2 emission from bottom trawling. For the Swedish audience.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone in the audience for participating and asking very good questions. I want to encourage you again, if you have suggestions on other subjects that you are interested in, reach out to us and we'll try to make it happen with external or internal experts. So I wish you all a very good week, and it's been nice to see you. Take care. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.